It's 6:30.
Yeah. It's time. So Ken is here. Budge here too? Or-
Yep.
Okay.
Bob. Yeah,
And-
Barbara.
You got the whole team.
Yeah.
You got the whole crew, plus
That's
a
good.
special guest. And Brian and Susan, I'd be happy to introduce the crew and then launch into our presentation with you. So the first four of us, are rather familiar faces at one point in time or another. We all either are or were school committee members. Barbara Rode is a member of the Heath Regionalization Study Team. Ken Rock is a member of our Heath Regionalization Study Team, and I'll give Ken credit for doing the yeoman's work on the development of the slides that we're going to be sharing with you. And even though his screen says Susan, we are stuck with Bob Bruin as the person we're going to talk with this evening. Hey, Bob. I would like to take a moment to just introduce Sarah Carlton, who is one of the primary consultants that we've been using after our receipt of this 191 grant. And Sarah is a retired DESE employee with a large background in working with the consolidation of various databases into data study tools that are very useful for folks, in particular, looking at regionalizations. Funny thing about that. But pulling together information from a variety of sources, Department of Revenue, DESE, and so forth, and integrating it into combined tools. And Barbara's been doing some of that same work for us. And it's been incredibly valuable. Barbara will be sharing some of that information in our later slides. And Bob, Ken, myself, and Sarah and Barbara will be sharing the presentation to you. And so here we go.
Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
It's going to be difficult for those who are on phones.
We'll do our best to read each one.
All right, good.
And we haven't rehearsed this, so you may hear a little bit of who's doing this slide. Roger, are you doing this one?
I certainly can. I'll introduce everything. What were our key questions? One of our first things we had to decide was, well, basically, is it in the interests of Heath to regionalize with Hollamont on a kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through 6 basis? Or is it better to remain a full member of the Mohawk Trail Regional School District? Those are the basic questions we've got. There are a lot of sub questions related, but that's kind of what we got. We get to slide 4. I believe that Bob was going to take over on slides 4 and 5.
I better unmute, huh?
You need to unmute, yes.
So what would the process be in order for Heath to regionalize with Hollamont? Heath would have to partially withdraw from the Mohawk district in the K6 section. The OPEB cost would be calculated and a payment plan created. We began discussions on that and have not necessarily finished all of that, but the Mohawk Trail regional agreement would have to be changed. All of the towns involved are involved, and so we would need a go-ahead from all of the towns in the district. So they would have to vote to approve any change in the regional agreement. And of course, this withdrawal by Heath would be one of those things that they would have to agree to. Then Heath would have to join the Hallmont district. And it would be a 3-town district of Charlemont, Hawley, and Heath, and would all need to approve this in their respective towns. So you have Mohawk approval, but you also have the 3 individual towns that would have to give their approval. And then the Commissioner of Education has to look at the plan that we came up with and approve the 2 revised regional districts, both the Mohawk one and the whatever new district would be created. And that would have to be done prior to any town meeting votes. We couldn't just vote on it without getting the go-ahead from the commission. So what happens if he doesn't regionalize with Hallmont? The tuition agreement between Mohawk Trail and Hallmont expires as of June of 2022. Heath will remain a full K-12 member of the Mohawk Trail District. Heath Elementary Schools students, would attend Mohawk Trail schools. We're not sure yet which school or schools that would be. It would have to be negotiated. Heath Elementary students would still be able to attend Hallmont through the school choice program if and only if Hallmont School Committee voted to accept them. That's true of any school choice decision by any school or any district. Once students were accepted under school choice, they are guaranteed enrollment in the future. So it's not 1 year and out. They could stay if they wanted to the completion of the grade level, which in this case would be 6th.
So as Bob just mentioned, the very old, actually older than I am, Hallmont Regional School District Agreement needs to be revised, or would need to be revised. And this is something that the Hallmont Regional Study Group has been working on for years. And a lot of it is just plain old, straightforward boilerplate, simple stuff. But there are 2 governance, in other words, voting related issues that have emerged, they've persisted, and they're not resolved. So we're going to share with you the rub first, and then go into a lot of other background data. So the 2 issues are, how do you pass the budget at the town meetings? And secondly, how do you approve any motion made at a school committee meeting? The background: school committee members would be 2-2-2. Currently at Hallmont, it's 3 and 3. Keep 6 members, 2-2-2. Each committee's member, each committee member's vote would be proportional to their town's population. This took a long time to discuss. The original intent was each person had their own vote. It was not until years into the process that we got a clear letter from DESI Legal that it became apparent that we were able to push through. No, we have to comply with the Constitution, 1 person, 1 vote, and we have to use weighted voting. All right. But exceptions persisted. And so instead of a budget being approved by 2/3 of the town meeting votes, which is the state law, the agreement would require all 3 towns vote yes. That requires special legislation. At school committee level, yes, you have weighted voting. But if you don't have both members from each town, from any of the towns voting yes, the motion fails. So in essence, requiring that all 3 towns approve instead of the 2/3 required by law, you give any town who chooses veto power, which doesn't exist in any other district in the Commonwealth. Again, special legislation required. The provision for at least one school committee member from each town voting yes gives an amazing level of veto power in certain areas. When we get to, this is slide number 9, I think when we get to the next slide, I'll direct your attention first to column C. Okay, Ken's moving us along. We'll talk about the top part of the page first. Just look at column C. So you've got 2 people from Charlemont, 2 people from Holly, 2 people from Heath voting. You add up their votes. That's the way weighted voting works. If you have a motion to do whatever, and you look at column C, you have over 85% weighted vote yes, but the motion would fail. That's a little bit unusual. I have to admit, I have served on many school committees, many school functions. I've never seen that. Please take your time at some point and go through, look for that particular dark color there. Those are the cases where you have a weighted vote that says yes, and yet the motion fails. The top part of the page is simply showing where the weighted votes come from. It's based on town population, and you have Charlemont, obviously, with the largest, over almost 55% of the population. Hawley at almost 15% of the population. Heath at almost 31% of the population. And so you just derive your votes from there. For those of us who have experience in weighted voting scenarios, and I would say that Bob, Barbara, Ken, and I do, I'm worth, and so is Barbara, about 3.5 at a Mohawk Trail meeting. The larger towns, Buckley, Shelburne, Coleraine, are worth about 9.5. And Suzanne, I know you're in the meeting. You're only like 2 or something. But you know what?
1.7.
Suzanne, what is it, Suzanne?
1.7.
1.7. Okay, I was close. Suzanne was vice chair of this school committee for a long time. That weight does not say everything about who and what you bring to the table. This is one of the rub points. This was presented on August 23rd to the Hollamont Heath Regionalization Study Group. We spent about 2 hours debating this. There was no give on this particular question. Again, it's a very detailed, comprehensive chart. It shows every possible voting combination. If you take the time to look at it in detail, it's sort of interesting what it shows. Ken, we can move on. That's what I need to say about this. This is the rub point.
Thank you, Budge. Thank you, Bob. We're gonna pivot now to providing some background information on demographics, enrollment, and quite a bit about finances. And we understand that some of this will seem sort of larger picture things, but we think over the long run, to figure out what's the best strategy for Heath, you also have to figure out what's the best strategy for Mohawk and maybe for the county as a whole. So you'll see we take, in some cases, a county view, and then a district-wide view, and then a town view. And broken down into demographic trends, wealth of towns, Chapter 70 funding prospects, relative spending levels of Mohawk Trail and Hollamont, and what we think the fiscal impact of regionalization or not regionalizing might be on Mohawk Trail, Hollamont, and Heath, all three. Sarah Carleton's going to step in and do this section on declining enrollment.
Okay, I'm very proud I remembered to unmute before I started talking. That rarely happens. So you want to give me the next slide? There we go. So as I'm sure you all know, declining enrollment has been a driving force in Franklin County and other rural counties in the state. And it's a continuing problem. And we'll show you some of the data that shows how the decline has been continuing for a while. It affects both education and finances. As you try to cut program to match the smaller number of students, you're obviously losing something educationally. If you don't cut anything, then your cost per student essentially rises and rises. So there's pressure on budgets to come up with money, even though there's fewer students. So the enrollment that we're going to look at here, I am going to pause and just say there's several different ways to count students that DESE uses. And I know it can be confusing because there are different numbers, but we'll just try and be very clear which numbers we're using. This is foundation enrollment, and it's the basis of allocation of Chapter 70 funds. And what's significant about it is that it is a count based on students that live in towns. So this is resident students, and it's by town. And then for regional districts, it gets rolled up into the regional allocations. But what you can see from this basic chart, we have data from the data is from a file that's online for every year in Chapter 70. It's called the complete summary file. And then there's a worksheet called regional allocation, which has the foundation enrollment for each town that's in a region. So we've pulled the data from there. And you can see that although there's little blips in every single one of these, that overall the direction is down.
Sarah, I just want to make sure that everyone understands these are K-12 numbers. These are not
Yes.
just the elementary school numbers.
All the students that live in the town
Yep.
and go to public schools.
Yes.
All right, so this is the table as opposed to the graph that you just saw. And the one thing I want to point out about it is that there are differing changes in different towns. Charlemont, for instance, bounces around not too far from 164 down to 159, and then it begins to go down 159, 150, 140, 128. So that's a trend that seems to be accelerating right now. Holly has a sudden high year in FY16 of 44. Again, a little inexplicable. I'm not sure what happened. Sometimes there's blips in data. Perhaps there were, for some reason, 10 more students than there have been. Then other than that, it bounces around in the 32 range and then finally begins to go down in FY22 at 27. And Heath, again, goes up a little bit and stays in the same general range for quite a while and then begins to tail down in FY22. So it's different patterns, but the net effect is that there's decline. And if the next slide would actually give you a good way to look at it, this is the foundation enrollment, all the resident students going to public schools for the 3 towns added together. And that's where you can see that the combination of the declining tendency means that the total for the 3 towns and the district that they would make with their K-6 students would be tending to decline. So now we're going to hand it back to Ken, who's going to talk about numbers which are counted in a different way. And you can maybe explain that briefly, Ken, from the way that we were looking at foundation enrollment.
Actually, Sarah, if you wanted to do this one,
Okay.
that would be great.
This is also resident students who lives in the town. The difference is that this is October 1 data that were students that were enrolled somewhere on October 1st of, for instance, 2021. And the foundation enrollment counts residents slightly differently, including that they're referring to the prior year so that they can do the calculations before this October 1 data is available. So slightly different numbers, but the same basic intent here, which is that we're talking about the residents. And so what you can see is that you have a few children that go to, students that go to Franklin County, and you're a member there. So that's one resident member group. And then there's resident members at Mohawk Trail, and there's students who are going in all grades just about, but particularly in the higher grades, who are going to schools in Mohawk Trail. Then we have a few students, one student going to the virtual district and another student from Hatfield choicing in, and then Rowe, there's a fair, choicing out to, I'm sorry. These are students going out to these districts. So choice is leaving Heath, going to the Greenfield virtual district, leaving and going to Hatfield, going to Rowe schools. What we noticed in particular was that the number of students choicing to Rowe was relatively high, 14 students. That's a noticeable fraction. A couple at the charter school, and then there's a couple of tuition agreements with Conway, but particularly with Halamont, which you all know about. So that's how you add up the different groups of students across all of the residents that you have, where they go to school and how they go there.
So I can pick it up from here. So from there, we're looking specifically at where the students enrolled in Halamont come from. And first, we'll just look at the numbers, and then later on, we'll come back to the fiscal implications of these numbers. But we've got 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And if we just go to the yearly average and the percent of the total, Charlemont has close to 50% of the students, Hawley about 10%, Heath 23%, and choice students, most of whom are choicing in from Mohawk Trail towns, other towns, almost 20%. And we'll come back to the implications of that. We're going to look at Chapter 70 data, a couple of different aspects of it. And the first is the comparative wealth of towns. In the Chapter 70 formula, they use a way to measure comparative wealth, which is based on a combination of a town's property wealth and income. And then that is applied to the foundation budget, which is the budget that it takes to educate the kids who are resident in the town, according to Department of Education calculations. And the percentage of the combined effort yield, the percentage of the foundation budget is capped at 82.5%. So all towns receive some Chapter 70 aid. This is a quick snapshot of Franklin County. And the blue bar shows this measure of wealth. And then the pink bar shows the percentage that DESE calculates they have to pay towards the foundation budget. And right at the top, you see Rowe, Irving, Leiden, Leverett exceeding the 82.5% cap. And way over on the right, you see by this measure, the less wealthy towns, Wendell, Heath, Greenfield, and Montague, Bernardston, and Charlemont. This is just to put the relative wealth of the towns we're talking about in perspective. And you see Hawley is somewhere in the middle, actually high middle by this measure. If we just look at Mohawk Trail and Halamont towns, you see, of course, Rowe is off the chart. Their combined effort yield is 326%. It's capped at 82.5%. Ashfield is 90, capped at 82.5. And then down here again in the corner, you've got Charlemont and Heath. By this measure, the least wealthy towns in these 3 districts. And Hawley, somewhat comparable to Ashfield and Plainfield. I'm actually going to hand this one back to Sarah as well. We wanted to look at the comparative fiscal health of the towns, and there's not a strict measure for that. So we did our best to sort of, drawing from DOR data, create a measure. And I'll just stress, when you regionalize when one town regionalizes with other towns, it's something like a business partnership. So you need to go in with your eyes open and with some clear idea of the fiscal health of the towns that you would be regionalizing with. So Sarah, can you?
Okay. First of all, the first three variables are a little bit about context. So population, as you know, these towns, Holly is much smaller than either town, but Heath is also just over half of Charlemont. Charlemont's definitely the biggest town by quite a bit. Resident public school students roughly reflect that. The percentage of students as a percentage of the local population, Heath is actually the highest. They're not too far apart, but Heath is the highest of those at 14%. So then we look at some of the finance measures. So income per capita is, sort of self-explanatory, but what's striking here is how much lower Heath's income per capita is. It goes 21,000 something for Charlemont, 19,000 for Holly, and 13,800 for Heath.
Wow.
The residential tax rate is the highest in Heath. And so to raise the taxes that you want to raise in Heath, you have to tax at a relatively higher rate against property values. The education spending as a percentage of the town budget, for reasons that might be hard to suss out quickly, it's a much higher percentage in Charlemont, and it's a more similar percentage, about a third, in Holly and Heath. And then free cash and stabilization as a percentage of town budget. These are DOR numbers, and free cash and stabilization funds are both reserves where towns have been able to set aside dollars that were appropriated but not spent in some prior year or years. And it's not a specific measure in any regular way, but what's valuable about looking at it in this way as a percentage of town budget is that it just gives you an idea of the reserve capacity. If a bad year came along, Holly would have a fair amount of reserves proportional to their budget to help cushion a year or more of tight budgets, where Charlemont is very tight at only 9%, and Heath is somewhat better at almost 20% in their free cash and stabilization funds, which the town controls. And the last measure, the DESI measure, it's the ones that that Ken's been showing you, basically the target local share, which varies across the towns, with Holly having the highest target local share, reflecting overall property and income being greater there. So the least wealthy town would have the lowest target local share, and that's Heath in this case.
Thank you, that's great. And we're in the process of developing yet another measure, and this is, we don't have the data yet, but this is our attempt to sort of measure the relative fiscal health, not of towns, but of school districts. So I did hear in a Hollemont school committee meeting, TMS report that they had some concerns about the sustainability of the Hollemont budget. So with lots and lots of help from Sarah, we started to look into reserves, and the expenditure and revenue picture and things such as school choice were not painting a clear picture. So we decided instead to look at end of year balances, which are generally reported on an end of year audit. And our attempt here is just to list all of the reserves that a school district might have. Not all of these are reported to DOR, so there's no standard reporting tool for these. But when we get this information, we'll certainly share it with everyone. Again, this is when you join a regional school district, you want to know something about the fiscal health of that school district. And this chart is dependent upon the previous chart. school choice, dollars net balance, reserves as a percentage of the budget, combined reserves. We can't calculate any of these things until we have the actual numbers. So this is a work in progress. Again, just to reiterate the obvious, by the measure of wealth that DESE uses, Charlemont and Heath are the least wealthy Mohawk Trail, Holomont towns. Ashfield, Hawley, Plainfield, Shelburne have somewhat similar levels of relative wealth. As Heath citizens, it says to us we have to be extremely careful what kind of business arrangements we enter, i.e. regionalization, because we don't have a lot of money to spare. The next thing we looked at is the revenues of school districts. And we're using a measure called actual net school spending. All of this data is drawn from a report that DESE updates regularly called profiles.xls, which shows the breakdown of Chapter 70 aid, local contribution, and local contributions above required, and also hold harmless funds. So we have a way of breaking it down so we can see this actual net school spending in 4 component parts. Again, we'll provide all this material to you so you'll be able to look at it closely, but this is the picture for Franklin County school districts. And this is a combination of Chapter 70 aid and local contributions. It does not include grants, transportation, and some other categories. But it's a pretty telling measure. And again, down on the low end of the scale, Orange, Greenfield, Mohawk Trail, Beale Montague, Holomont, in the least wealthy, and of course, Rowe, Irving, New Salem, Wendell, up a little higher. Franklin County is a one of a kind because it's a technical school. So in order to really understand that, you'd have to compare it to other regional voc tech schools, which we're not doing in this set of figures. This is just the table that the next chart is going to show you. And this is the one I'll spend just a minute on. This is actual net school spending for Rowe, Holomont, and Mohawk Trail. And this is all based on FY, is this 21 or 22?
21.
21, thank you. And to our surprise, we found that Holomont is their actual net school spending is actually more than Mohawk Trails. But what jumps out to me is the difference in hold harmless aid. This is on a per pupil basis. Mohawk is receiving in this year $2,320 per student in Chapter 70 hold harmless aid. And then the local contribution on the assessment for each student credited or charged to a town is about $3,000. In Holomont, the hold harmless aid is only about $774. This is a consequence usually of declining enrollment. But the local contribution per FTE is substantially higher than Mohawk Trails. It's for this year, $43.88. So again, what is the data telling us? Mohawk Trail has a lot of hold harmless aid compared to Holomont. Holomont's actual net school spending is actually higher than Mohawk Trails, as is their local contributions above required. And a little side note, if you look at the red or pink portion, that's foundation aid is calculated by the Department of Education on a per pupil basis. And generally it reflects student need. So if you have economically disadvantaged students, they get a higher calculation of foundation budget. So in some sense, the per pupil foundation budget for Holomont being higher than Mohawk Trails is some indication of greater student need. And we're going to stay with hold harmless aid for a minute because we think it has some real implications regionally and also legislatively. It's grandfathered aid. It's over and above what the foundation formula would dictate that you get. It's a consequence of declining enrollment and from the legislature's decision on an annual basis that no district will get less than they got the prior year. I think you're probably all familiar with the Student Opportunity Act, which is we're in the second or third year of that. Dramatic revision of Chapter 70 funding. It's substantially increasing aid to the least wealthy districts in the Commonwealth. And then for districts that would see no increase under that, there's a per pupil minimum. Why is this important? This is a chart showing the comparison between hold harmless aid. This is jumping to the next fiscal year, FY22, and the $30 per student minimum aid. If you're receiving hold harmless aid, that effectively absorbs any increases in Chapter 70 aid that you would otherwise see under the increases built into the Student Opportunity Act. Why is this important? The implication here is it's unlikely that Hall-Lamont or Mohawk Trail are going to see significant increases in Chapter 70 funding for the foreseeable future because of the levels of hold harmless aid they're already receiving. In other words, it's not likely that the state is going to step in and save us in a big way with substantial increases in Chapter 70 aid. It may be that the Rural Coalition can advocate for other kinds of increases, but given the formula as it's written in the Student Opportunity Act, the prospect is limited for increases in Chapter 78. So I'll just read the second bulleted point, which is long, it's almost a paragraph, and I didn't find a way to say it more briefly, but I'll just read it. Absent efficiencies gained through regionalization or significant collaboration, future costs of normal inflationary increases in school budgets will either result in increased local assessments or will necessitate reductions in educational services. This is what Sarah was talking about before, the dilemma that we're in when you have declining enrollment. I mean, I've worked in districts and dealt with their budgets, and they run anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5, 4% inflationary increases through teacher contracts and so on each year. If your Chapter 78 is flat, which is what we're describing, and inflationary increases are pushing your core costs up, you're faced with a dilemma of either cutting services or increasing local assessments. If we're looking at a town like Heath, we're already perilously close to the taxation limits, and we're not the only one. So, and lastly, I think everyone's aware of this. Any reduction or restriction of hold harmless aid would really be harmful to many Franklin County school districts. Whether it's fair that we have it, the removal of it would create very difficult situations for our schools. The last big piece of this is to compare how kids are enrolled in schools. We know if you're a district member, you go to those district schools, and we'll just call it district membership. But the other two ways we're looking at it today are tuition agreements and school choice. Right now, Mohawk Trail has a tuition agreement with Hall-Lamont for Heath Elementary students. The negotiated price this year is $11,500. It expires in June of next year. School choice, which could be called parental school choice or familial school choice, is set by law at $5,000. It's always available to families if the receiving school has opted into the program. Why is this important? You'll see what the impacts of this are, but first, just a data note or two. This is all modeled on FY21. We're assuming that the amount of Chapter 70 aid does not change, and we're going to look at district membership, school choice, and tuition agreement. All of this is derived from the DESE profiles.xls workbook. Transportation costs are not included, SPED costs are not included, and choice costs are limited to base rate, that it does not include SPED cost chargebacks. So just to bring it home, with apologies to the airlines, you know, you've all read articles about, you can be sitting next to somebody and they have a much less expensive seat on the airline than you do. This is the easy way for me to think about it. You can have, and I look for classroom seats, but I like the airline picture instead. You can have 3 students side by side in the Hall-Lamont school classroom. And we know there's no first class, economy class, et cetera, and business class. Once the kids get to school, they all get the services they need. But the choice seat brings in revenues of $5,000, the tuition seat $11,500, and the district member seat that we know from the actual net school spending over $18,000. Again, if we look back at our enrollment chart, you can do the mental math on this. The Charlemont and Hawley students are bringing in about $18,000 each. The Heath students about $11,500, and the choice students from other districts $5,000 each. Which brings us to why this is important for the finances of Mohawk Trail and Hall-Lamont, and less so for the finances of Heath. This chart is comparing FY21, and it's the actual is the top line that says tuition, actual tuition agreement. It's bringing in $333,500 to Hall-Lamont. What if all those students were choice students instead? Hall-Lamont would see a reduction in their revenue of $188,500. What if instead he's joined Hall-Lamont and Hall-Lamont assessed Heath for the same amount that they're assessing Charlemont and Hawley now, which is an open question because they might choose to reduce costs or reduce assessments instead, but just using that metric, Hall-Lamont would have an increase in revenue of $193,575. So by this measure, and it's a rough measure, this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation, the status of Heath students in Hall-Lamont to Hall-Lamont represent a swing in the neighborhood of $300,000. And for a budget the size of Hall-Lamont's, that's really critical. If we look at it from the Mohawk Trail perspective, it's pretty much the mirror image of that. It's a little bit different because actual net school spending is different for the 2 districts. But right now they're paying $333,500 through the tuition agreement that was negotiated. If Heath returns to Mohawk, the tuition agreement ends, and if all of the parents chose to choice into Hall-Lamont and Hall-Lamont accepts them all, the cost to Mohawk would be reduced by $188,500. And really that's probably a low estimate because it's reasonable to assume that many parents would not choice into Hall-Lamont, but would just go to the designated Mohawk school. And that number of students times $5,000, that would represent even less revenue flowing, less of a cost to Mohawk Trail. If, and let me just go to the Heath. The impact on Heath is much less clear and decisive, and the level of urgency is much less. I will say using this calculation, which is based on the Hall-Lamont actual net school spending, the local contribution required and above local, Heath might pay a little bit more at Hall-Lamont, but you could easily plug in different numbers and show Heath paying a little bit less. It's a tough number to come up with. And we know that FY21 is a COVID year. To some extent, all bets are off for FY21, and we're going to have to track the years as the students come back and so on. But the bottom line for this is that the fiscal impact on Heath, whether or not Heath is a member of Hall, it's not clear that there's a benefit, but there's certainly, you're not going to see the big swings that you're seeing for both Mohawk Trail and Hall-Lamont. And again, we can come back to any of this if you want to. This leads us to say that and this is based on site visits to schools. If Heath regionalizes with Hallmont, Heath school children are going to, elementary school children are going to get a good education. If we don't regionalize, but Mohawk Trail extends the tuition agreement, the current arrangement will continue. If we do not regionalize with Hallmont and Mohawk Trail does not extend the tuition agreement, these school children will receive a good education at Mohawk schools. So it's not so much a question of one education being significantly better than the other. And if we rejoin the Mohawk Elementary School, we know that some students will likely choice their kids to Hallmont, where we believe they will receive a good education. So for us, we're not in crisis about this, but we need to make a decision. And with that, we're going to move into the opinion section now, or the conclusion section. And each of us has a slide that we're going to go through.
So that goes to me. Hi, I'm Barbara Road. So thank you, Ken, for all of the work, and Sarah for all of the data and pulling that slideshow together. There's still more information we can add, and we know there's more information that we can add, but we wanted to present to the select board our findings so far, as we are running into some roadblocks as Budge was alluding to last week. There were some meetings that we were having difficulty in communicating some questions and getting some answers on, and openness on the other side of our negotiating partners. So I kind of feel bad that there's a summary of findings on my slide, but I'm going to walk through a few of these, most of these, with just a few points of, I come to this study team with the lens of a parent and a taxpayer. My other three colleagues on this study team, including Sarah, my other four, all have experience in the Department of Education and understanding all of these formulas. When I pay my taxes, or my parents pay their taxes and they're on a fixed income in their 80s in the town of Heath, I like to answer the question, what are the services we're getting for our money for the best education we can give our students? So the teeny tiny history of what brought me to study Hallmont further, sitting on Mohawk Trail Regional School District School Committee, is I knew this decision was up and coming pre-COVID, because Budge and Bob had been working hard on the study group. There was zero reason to pay attention at that time for me. But what sparked my curiosity to answer the question, what's going on with our students down at Hallmont? And I want to preface everything I'm about to say on this site visit and on witnessing Hallmont and our central office pull it together through this extraordinary year of remote learning and pandemic. I think Hallmont is a great school. I think they're doing a great job, and I think the families going there are served well. And none of this is a reflection on staff or administration or the families that go there. It's just, I sit in a chair that I have to make a decision, and it's an incredibly difficult decision. I am thinking very deeply that every single one of the numbers in the enrollment charts that you just witnessed is a student belonging to a family and a resident in our town. So I take that that stress, as my colleagues will know, I'm under stress over this. I take that I just take the weight of this as it's enormous. So these are my recommendations, and I am open to all other recommendations, but I have to be honest in my findings. So I'm just going to look down and read some of my notes. They are brief, but the current concerns that I am about to highlight do not fit in a graph that we can portray, as Ken just showed so beautifully. They're broader topics. So the principal of Hallmont in the fall of 2020 notified the Heath families that they didn't fit in the internet hub. This is what led me to begin conducting my own research, just on my own behalf. I was curious how we didn't fit into the school that we are paying tuition to go into. So it was not necessarily the administration's fault for this. We were flying under a pandemic, but I was curious why the breakdown was Heath didn't fit and Charlemont and Hawley did fit in the internet hub. This sparked an emergency to our town to produce an internet hub staffed by volunteers for students in need, adding additional cost and stress to our town during pandemic remote learning. You're all aware of that. Many of you worked on that. I thank the town of Heath for getting us through that. But that in and of itself sparked for me the age-old, does Heath belong somewhere? I was a Heath parent for 4 of my kids that went through 6 principals at the Heath Elementary School. I had nieces and nephews that were in other schools that didn't belong. You all know the history of belonging in Heath. It's an age-old problem. So for me, it's important that wherever we choose, I want to see a sense of belonging for our town that we bring with our families. Assets, we bring volunteerism, we bring amazing students with amazing capabilities, and I do want to feel not only are we paying that we belong, but that we really are welcome. So that's important for me. So the concerns grew as I started attending remote meetings myself long before our study team was created. I went to a meeting that the Hawlemont, we'll start with Hawlemont budget instability on my bullet on the left, concerns. So the budget presentation, the budget reporting described instability, words of crisis and unsustainability. There were direct cuts made affecting teacher to student ratio and to the negative. We were cutting a teacher as asked by the school committee and against the superintendent's recommendation at that point. And there were also questions, never answered, of course, but questions of the school committee of would the towns support them and would the towns approve them and or disapprove of them? And if the towns were disapproving, what would happen to the school budget? So I did find a lack of knowledge, I guess, between the school committee and the town representatives that I just sparked my interest further sitting on Mohawk School Committee. That we frequently have town reports, that we know where our town select boards are sitting. And the next bullet, Hawlemont percentile ranking. I was totally unaware until the Hawlemont principal reported that they were in an intervention status, reporting that they were the lowest 10% of the Commonwealth on the DESE website. It was a concern. I'm not sure it still is a concern because there are definitely plans for improvement, and my other colleagues on this study team report that that's not as abnormal as I would think, but I think it's really important to include that we are measuring the success of the education that we're providing to our students. Number 3, Hawlemont School Committee delay of hybrid option. The reason I chose this one was this is an example of what that veto power, back where Budge was showing in our chart on that C, where one town could veto another, what a veto power could look like in the future and what the power could be. So the Hawlemont School Committee delayed the hybrid option for half-day in-school opportunity for students when it was presented. It was presented in January, and I believe, I have it in my notes, I believe it passed eventually in March. So the Hawlemont School Committee delayed hybrid option for half-day in-school opportunity for students when it was available for approximately 2 months over a dispute between their school committee and the superintendent. That ultimately created less in-person instruction for Hawlemont students versus all other elementary schools in the area. So that's just a simple example of what a vote at school committee, how that can gridlock our students' education and totally affect our families in the long run. Finally, Hawlemont communication challenges. I'm going to try to be as brief and vague as possible on this. It's not going well. So, so Budge was at a meeting on 8/23, August 23rd, just last week, that what he presented, questions on these non-conforming articles and the regional proposed agreement, and there was no give on the other side. What happened was I was scheduled to be at a meeting on 8/25 to discuss several other questions that the Town of Heath study team had for the Holloman study team. And at that meeting, we actually received an email from the chair the night prior that he was not going to attend the meeting, and pointed out several reasons why. But we continue to witness and experience challenges in communication on something that is so paramount to choose for our future. So I'd like to move over to my findings. So after 6 months on our Heath study team, which I appreciate very much, everyone working together for the last 6 months every Thursday, reviewing the potential leaving of Mohawk Trail Regional School District K-6 to regionalize with Holloman School District, my observations and findings are as follows. Heath joining Holloman could pose a fiscal risk to Heath. That is directly linked to the next bullet. As Ken just suggested, there may not necessarily be an increase in cost to our taxpayers, but the future is completely unknown. And that's what I base this on. It is a risk because the next section is something that hasn't been brought up yet. Holloman School Committee is exploring alternative central office options, so creating a larger divide. Further explanation of what that actually means. In the last several meetings of the Holloman School Committee, it has come up from some of their present school committee members, and even questioned by some of the other school committee members that sit on there, that they're not totally understanding what the process is that is happening. But they are actively researching a complete removal from what we call the 2-district agreement, which shares our services between Mohawk Trail and Holloman, of the superintendent, the director of special education, the financial management team, the facilities coordinator, transportation coordinator. All of that being said, with the Mohawk Trail, School District, and they are looking to research, they're researching to join potentially the North Berkshire School Union. None of that do we have any information on other than they're researching that. This is creating a larger divide of unknown future services for our students and unknown costs to our taxpayers. It was offered from a member that maybe Heath could save some money in this, and maybe that's true. But in our current status and for the foreseeable future, I'm not willing to stake our next generation of pre-K through 6 on maybe that will help. I think there are way too many variables in the air to feel comfortable joining something that's actually going to be leaving what I've known to trust. So sitting on the Mohawk Trail School Committee, I do not think everything is perfect over there. I think we have a lot of work to do on improving our schools. It's a constant improvement plan, but I do see stability there, and I do see discussion there, and I do see communication between the towns and the schools. And I feel more comfortable in staking the future in that direction than I do for all of the variables that I've just stated. So my final sentence, I do not feel it is in the best interest for our students, our families, or our taxpayers to leave Mohawk Trail and regionalize with Holloman. So I do recommend staying with Mohawk Trail for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Okay, I'm up next. I'm going to take a little bit different approach, more historical and personal. and try to get through this as quick as possible. I would remind everybody that we had a heartbreaking choice to make when we chose to close the Heath School. What happened was there was great teamwork working with Mohawk, the Heath team and the Mohawk team, on an agreement. There was give and take. We were listened to, and we came to a consensus that Hollimont would be the best choice and that we would have a strong say in how our students would learn and live. And that was important to all of us. We had choices. We could have gone to other schools. When we were talking to Mohawk, we chose Hollimont. We stood up at town meeting to express our team's desire to have a shared experience for all our kids going to one school. The town voted overwhelmingly for that, in favor of that. Now, I think, as I think back on it, I think maybe there was a hint of nostalgia in my heart when we were doing that, because school choice had already scattered our students to the wind, and it's not just in Heath, it is across the state. School choice has changed the way that things happen in schools. Maybe I didn't want to admit that, I don't know, but it's a problem. So what happened then was we, Budge and I, started meeting with the regionalization group from Hawley and Charlemont. And initially it was very easy, it always is. The low-hanging fruit got picked and things were going well. But then we got to the hard parts, and we were going to have to ask for support for special legislation. And we were starting to build a sense that maybe we should do that. Then we had a superintendency emergency followed by COVID. And maybe in some ways that was a good thing. It gave us a chance to step back and do some thinking. And then we worked to have that grant, which was giving us the solid information that we really needed. Not feelings, but solid information. But even with solid information, a consensus has been very hard to reach. So what's the tipping point for me? The tipping point for me in my decision was that recently, as Barbara alluded, it's become apparent that Hollimont was working to move away from a shared superintendency with Mohawk. From the beginning, the Mohawk district has been, in their dealings with Heath, have been thoughtful, reasonable, and helpful partners. Middle ground was always found. We talked, we came in from different sides on things, but we got to a point where we could agree and move forward. After giving us their support, the Mohawk district, it would be, I think, disrespectful of their good efforts, their considerations, to just kind of tip our hats and say goodbye and join a district that's looking to move away from Mohawk. I personally just couldn't do that. I couldn't urge us to join a new district that would do that. So I've spent lots of time at Hollimont in many different ways, and it's a wonderful, hardworking place that its students love. But right now, I can't recommend forming a three-town district at this time. Thank you.
Well, my turn. Bob and Barbara, thank you for your comments. It's really important. Bob took a little trip back in history. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as I can, but my bottom line is I am very unsettled and very conflicted at this moment. I'm going to go back to the early 1980s when I was first elected to the Heath School Committee. Yes, there was such a thing back then. We tuitioned our children to the Rowe Elementary School, town-to-town tuition agreement. I attended all of the Rowe School Committee meetings. I even participated with them on teacher negotiations. Of course, I was a non-voting member. It seems to be a trend in my past. Late 1980s, Rowe pressed a panic button because there was a growth of population in the town of Heath, particularly of young children. They limited our tuition agreement. We tried to negotiate a regional school district agreement with them. It would have been a sensible thing to do. We could have shared the cost of putting an addition onto that building. Sue Lively, who I know is still here, was a part of that team also. Long negotiations, not as long as these, I'll tell you, but long negotiations. My recollection is that when Heath town meeting voted, all but 3 people voted yes. It was defeated in Rowe. What are you going to do? What do you do to help Heath have solid education for its children? We built a school. That was the second choice of the Long Range Planning Committee. It was wonderful. It gave us so many years, 20 or so, of wonderful education for our children. But the concern was that a single little bitty town trying to fill a single little bitty school wasn't going to work. It didn't. Bob and I both served on the building committee for that school. In the end, we both served on the committee that had to take the vote to close it. Kind of stinks. Still trying to figure out where to put our kids. What are the realities? As both Barbara and Bob have mentioned, educationally, I'm an educator. Classroom teacher, administrator. That's my entire career. I value what I see in terms of the education at Haldimand. As an educator, I know what I'm talking about. It's a good, solid education with great potential to expand and grow. And yes, they are dealing with student performance issues, and they are not the first school to ever do so. When I became the principal at Sanderson, we were doing the exact same things. It took the staff and I 2 years to turn it around and become one of the highest performing schools in the Commonwealth. BSC has just gone through a similar process. Yes, it's a concern. Yes, it's a process. Ken knows a heck of a lot more about it than I do. That's part of his day job, is helping school districts and schools figure this out. Cost risks. Anytime you look at a little bitty district, you have the potential for a large cost. The easiest one to explain to everybody is an out-of-district special education expenditure. If you only get to share it between 2 or 3 towns instead of among 8, the impact is far greater. If that little bitty district has virtually no reserves, it's a huge problem. So just things to be aware of. Proximity, fact of the matter is, Haldimand is closest for most of the kids in Heath. Not every kid, obviously, but most of them it is. Governance. These are those early slides that I said were the rub point. This continues to be a rubbing point. We've not seen give here. It's just, I've worked on enough different school committees and different organizations. I have never seen a demand that a veto power, particularly at the committee level, be in place. And there's no give. I don't know what else to say. the 2 district plans, Bob and Barbara addressed that very well. Withdrawal from Mohawk, we talked about it quickly. If we were to continue to go that route, yes, we've had extensive talks with Mohawk Trail about a potential OPEB solution mechanism. We'd have to dust those talks off and see if they worked out and see what the numbers looked like for us. But there's a liability there. That's what OPEB is a liability. But most importantly to me is the education of our kids. And we need to figure out how to get information in the hands of the parents and the community members in Heath, and I think also in Charlemont and Hawley, and begin communicating with them about what's up. Our study team meets on Thursday. This overall, where are we decision will be one of our biggest conversations. It is a very, very difficult choice. A number of decades of trying to sort out how best to give Heath kids, elementary school kids, a solid education. And man, it is still a moving target. Very unsettling. That's where I stand. Very unsettled. On to you, Ken.
Yeah. So these are sort of my conclusions after, as we said, much thought. To our very patient audience, this is the last slide. I know you'll be disappointed, but we don't have any more after this one. I'm convinced that Heath Elementary students get a good education at Hallmont and that they get a good education at Mohawk Trail. We don't have any clear evidence that it's of economic benefit to Heath in joining Hallmont. We do have some indication that there are economic risks. At this point, to me, the risks and the costs of trying to get it out of one agreement and into another outweigh the benefits. Even if the voting issues, for example, could be resolved, we described the process of getting out and joining another district to you in the beginning because it's not a simple or quick process. So I think that it's extremely unlikely that it could be concluded this year, even if there was agreement on the regional agreement. And my understanding of the tuition agreement is we need to start discussing that this fall with Mohawk Trail. So my preference would be that he start those conversations with Mohawk Trail so that we can involve parents, for example, in the discussion about where Heath school children should attend school in 22-23. And I'll stop sharing now and turn it back to Budge.
So I just want to thank everyone for their patience and thank our select board for the opportunity to share what we have learned so far and kind of where we stand. I didn't get to see if Robin was able to join us. She wasn't. That's unfortunate. You know, one of the challenges we've felt along the way that many of us have is just our ability to reach out and communicate to broader audiences. And you know, that's something that this team can talk about on Thursday, as we talk about do we have a clear recommendation to make to the select board, and how we look at the future. There are a lot of unknowns and a lot of question marks. But that's what we got, folks. Be great to give you all kinds of real shiny, nice, sparkly good news and solid conclusions and all, but sorry, that's not what we were dealing with. And I want to thank Evie and Suzanne and Martha for joining us. I know that they've been tracking what we've been doing And I appreciate their taking the time to log in and listen to what we're doing. I hope it's been informative and helpful.
And I'd like to thank Sarah too for both being here, but also for the amazing amount of clarity she brought to her piece of the puzzle, and it meant a lot to us. So thanks again.
Yep. Agree.
I want to thank all of you for the tremendous amount of work and research you've been doing. And this has not been an easy process that you've been going through, and your dedication has been amazing, and I'm exhausted, so you must be. I'm tired just listening to it all. So thank you.
Remember those meetings, Sue.
Yeah, I too am deeply appreciative of the effort that was brought to this process and the expertise that was contributed. I'm kind of blown away. I didn't expect this kind of kind of report, this recommendations. It also indicated, I mean, there was information about the town of Poly that I had no idea about, about their financial position compared to other towns. And I think this is a good illustration of the value of a process like this, of taking the time, just standing back, putting aside your prejudices and taking a good hard look at the data and coming to a conclusion. I just wouldn't have imagined we'd be here this soon, and I am very appreciative of all of your work. So thank you.
We will be getting a copy of the slides.
I'll send it to Hilma right now.
Okay.
This
I really need some time to go back over it.
Yep.
Yeah. And Ken, I would like to send a copy of this to Superintendent Cheryl Stanton. I didn't let her know this meeting was happening. As superintendent of both districts, she is in, I think we can all understand, a rather awkward position. I do not wish to engage in any blindsiding. I want to share this with her, if that's okay with you.
That's quite okay. And I should just add one thing, which is, most of you know my day job is in part doing this kind of work in other places in the Commonwealth, but none of this was done for the Department of Education. And I do not have my Department of Education hat on today. I have my Heath citizen hat on today. And even though we use some tools that have been developed in other places, this is not the opinion of anybody in the Department of Education. I had a long conversation with the Department of Ethics at DESE before I started this project about potential conflicts of interest, and they just made it clear that I have to be clear with what voice that I'm speaking. So when I send out the PowerPoint, I'm going to just put a couple of clauses in the email. So if you would send the email, forward the email so that people can read that as well. Basically, I would say any mistakes in the data are mine. They're not the Department of Education's. And if anybody finds anything that's incorrect, we want to have accurate information. I'd really appreciate that information coming back to all of us. But I'll send it out with those sort of qualifications. And after that, this is a public meeting, so it's public information. It can be sent out.
Great. Thank you, Ken, for all the work on the slideshow in particular. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We all say goodbye.
Hi, Budge. Hey, Budge, are you there?
I am still.
Budge, it's Beth. I just wanted to let you know that I was here and that obviously I appreciate and have full understanding of everything that you and Bob have done. So,
Beth, great. I'm sorry I didn't recognize your phone number.
No, that's okay. I actually misread the email because I didn't have my glasses on and I logged on early.
No, Beth, I am so glad you could join us. Thank you.
Okay.
And
Thank you so much.
I would throw in that Beth was a really great partner and hope to work together on stuff. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you, guys. Everybody have a good night.
All right. Thanks,
For everyone
folks.
who is not aware,
Bye now.
Beth Flaherty is a Charlemont representative to the Hall-Lamont School Committee and is chair of the Hall-Lamont Heath Regionalization Study Group. Just, we can begin to put more pieces together. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
I'm out of here.
Last question, if somebody wants to view the recording of this, where will it be posted?
It will be posted on the select board page on the town website. And if you go to the select board page, there is then a link that I believe says meeting recordings or something like that.
Yes, meeting recordings.
Yeah. And you can go in there and find it by date. Is that correct, Pat?
Yes,
And they're kept for a while?
they're kept for quite a while.
Okay.
None have been removed so far.
Okay, great. Thank you again.
So before everyone, oh, they can go. Okay. Hi, can I jump in and ask a question to the select board? You can hear me okay? I unmuted, yes. So hi, so here we are moving forward. There's more data collection that we expect back from some of our financial partners. There's TMS is working on a project that we gave them. And we just presented our thoughts and opinions so far of what we're collecting. I am curious. It is a shame that Robin's not here, and I'm certain Robin will watch the recording to catch up, and Hilma will get Robin the report, and we would all be available for questions if Robin has any. But I'm curious, Sue and Brian, other than the thank yous, which you're welcome, and never in a million years, you both should know that I had no idea I'd be sitting here in this complex of a situation. But I'm curious how you thoughts from from each of you individually on, did you hear anything that you wish that we should pursue further, try harder, anything like that? Because, the four of us are coming to you as individuals in the study team, but our study team is working at the pleasure of the select board, and the future is for the town resident students. So Budge and I have to go vote at Mohawk Trail School Committee. But it would be interesting, and I understand you may not have thoughts this evening because of how complex it was that we just presented, but like countertop thoughts or anything you can offer at this point?
I would say, I appreciate the opinions. I mean, you have studied opinions that you gave about this potential agreement. And, I think we need time to digest the report. And I think we need to hear that report at some point needs to be distributed to the town, and that we need to get some feedback on that too. Because sometimes if people realize where things are going, they might respond to the to the issue at hand. But I just don't want to give an opinion. I think you have done a better job of formulating thoughts than I would at this point.
I would say that I agree with Brian. It's too much to absorb, but a lot of the questions that you have raised are questions that I've had for a while myself, about the sustainability of and the possibilities of staying with Hall-Lamont, what's the benefit and what would be the benefit of staying with Mohawk. And you've brought me some information on those things that really help me put everything into a better perspective, and have confirmed that some of my questions were appropriate to be asking. So, but it's going to take some time to absorb all this and really think about it.
Okay. I'd also just like to let both of you know, and I've let our study team know prior to this, I personally am not in favor of asking Mohawk Trail to extend the tuition agreement of the 11.5 because we've exhausted that. So I don't think it's fair to the regional, the Mohawk Trail School District. So I just want you to know that that's where I stand on that. If that were to come up as a question on that school committee, I personally can't ask them to extend that any further than this coming year. So I do feel that we're at the point of a decision-making process. And I do feel that you should have some time at the select board level, and I can ask for that time at the school committee level to digest some of this. And at some point, Budge and Bob will be delivering these opinions to the Hollamont School District study team. So I don't know how we communicate back and forth, but I do think that we need to have lines of communication open as we go forward. And I know Martha's here and listening, and I appreciate that, but I'm sure I'll have questions for Martha in process. So, but thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay.